Welcome to this interview preparation session. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to go through, first of all, some information that we only share with our candidates at BCG. Then I'm going to provide you with links. This is a PDF that discusses that we give to candidates that's been enormously effective. We typically have a very high conversion of candidates that go through our interview preparation process compared to those that don't. So just this initial information I'm going to share with you tends to get, a high percentage of candidates jobs, meaning, 60, 70% follow this information. And then in terms of candidates, don't go on or use this information. Typically the rate of them getting jobs and offers is like 10 to 20%. So this information is, very powerful. Hopefully if you spend time in this webinar today, you're going to, really transform how you get jobs and what happens when you go into interviews. I think personally, in terms of webinars, this could be one of the most important, things that you ever learn about, because there's so many issues with people not getting jobs because they don't know what to do with the interview. Just as a little background, I've been doing what I do for 25 years. I only do law firm placements. So I only convert people, to get jobs in law firms. I know what gets people jobs in law firms and what doesn't. And this information is extremely powerful. And it's definitely, if you understand this and you take notes, it's going to make a huge difference. It will increase by 50% or more the number of jobs you get in response to going out on interviews. And I will share with you today the information that I share with candidates that helps them get interviews when they follow the information. So the way the webinar will work is I will go through this information and explain it to you in a way that hopefully is succinct enough that you'll understand it. We won't spend a lot of time in each issue, and then you can dive deeper in the links that I'll put in the chat, or we can also send follow-up links to these PDFs for everyone that's involved today. So in this guide, we talk about the fact is, like, if the law firm's interviewing you, they really want to hire you. They have a job that needs to be done. They want someone that's going to kind of pass all these tests that they have when they're interviewing people and questions. And, you just need to understand that what happens when you go into interviews is that you're often, most often disqualifying yourself from jobs based on your answers to different questions. Now, this isn't a webinar about answering each individual question. I will do that most likely for you next week. But this is, an interview about, a discussion about, the most important things that you can do and kind of look out for in your interviews. There's an article that I wrote a long time ago that I think, is very important to interviewing. It's kind of like the core what you need to do to get a job. And it's about called The Message to Garcia in Your Career. And essentially what that goes over or discusses is, if someone, gives you something to do, you always do it. You do it without question. Make sure that it's done as well as you possibly can, that you're basically, the idea would be that you portray yourself as a very good worker that isn't going to mess around and will get stuff done for, during, for people, you're working for. 1 second, I've got a hair here, crazy. Give me a second. I apologize for that. Crazy office with hair. I won't get into it. But this is the idea. So, anytime a law firm has a job, they're just very focused on hiring someone that is going to work very hard, not raise a lot of questions, just get everything done. And if you think about that, it's kind of the same thing that you would want if you were hiring someone. If someone was coming to you with excuses or not figuring out the work that needs to be done, not working as hard as possible, and so forth, you would not want to hire them. So I recommend reading this, the PDF that I'm sending you. And, your job when you go into any position is to basically give the employer that you're the very, very best person for, whatever job, whatever work that they have. And this is what the best attorneys do. The best attorneys, when they have clients, will go as far as they can to get the best result. And as an associate, that's your job. And also as a partner, that's your job. You need to do everything you can to get, to do the assignments, and it's never about ego and what you want. It's about just getting the work done. And in law firms, there are very, very few people like that. One of the things that I noticed is, in my career, is it's very common for often the best attorneys that went to the best law schools to be very aware of how special they are based on the law school they went to. and make everything about them, what they need, and they're just very, very ego-centered, and a lot of times the same thing happens with other attorneys that may not have the best background as well. They're very, very focused on what they want, and this sort of stuff just blows up jobs all the time. And so if you seem someone that's like focused on yourself and what you want, you're going to have a hard time advancing in law firms. I'm not saying people should take advantage of you, but if you are very focused on doing good work, you don't question people like they need to do the work. You're not trying to get out of working hours and that sort of thing. That's what you need. And the people that last in law firms, legal profession, are ones that have done that their entire career. They do it for the people they work for early on, and they do it for clients, and that's kind of what it's all about. So you should never think about going into any interview and making it about what you want. You always want to make it about what the firm wants, and if you're able to do that, then most of the time you'll get employed. You certainly can ask questions about salary, working remotely, benefits, and all that sort of stuff after you get hired. But your job when you're interviewing initially is to just get the job. Like if you look like you're focused on yourself, then the law firm's going to think that you're going to be a problem and won't hire you. And this sort of thing is almost the most basic thing of interviewing with any firm. I mean, you need to come across as focused on what the firm wants, and actually someone that wants to do the work and will, just do whatever they need and won't make it about yourself. A light analogy that an attorney I was working for early in my career gave me is that, when you're an associate, you're expected to be a soldier. Soldiers are people that just do whatever's asked of them, that are there to learn, don't question authority, and just work and do their very, very best. Generals are people that give other people orders, and other people give them respect. So every attorney that you could possibly work with wants to feel important, wants to feel like you're going to do the things that you ask of them, wants to feel like you're grateful for the job. And so anytime you do that in any type of interview, it's going to really create a lot of problems for you. So you really can't focus on what other people want. Another thing I would tell you is that this is something that the most successful lawyers do throughout their entire career. Partners in law firms that have huge books of business, like 5, 10, 20, $30 million. They're also look at that camera. Sorry about that. Just having a really hard time this morning. Jeez. Hold on. Sorry about this. Having a really hard time this morning. So give me 1 second. Sorry. All right, now that's okay. There we go. Okay, so partners that work in large law firms that have big books of business, they also don't have egos. Like, you have partners. I've seen partners that are making $10 million a year, like petty giant law firms, and they're just like, yes, sir, thank you, sir. Like, to clients, they're not even, they're not. It's not about their ego. They do things like they don't often drive expensive cars because they don't want to have resentment by clients. They follow the rules that the law firm may have about different things, in terms of reporting their hours or whatever they need to do. So they're also very manageable. And so people do not like it when you're not, manageable, and that you seem like everything's about you. So everyone goes into interviews thinking everything, what does the law firm offer? What can you do for me? And that sort of thing. You don't realize when you do that the law firm is most often interviewing multiple people, and they're going to hire people that don't do that. So it's important to understand those facts. Now, when I have BCG clients or candidates, I typically go through this short PDF. I don't spend more than 30 minutes on it. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about this stuff with you because there's a lot of other matters, that I need to cover. But, your goal in any interview, it's just important to understand, is to get to the next stage of the interview process. Like, you don't want to give the law firm any reason not to hire you when you're going to the first steps. And so the first steps of an interview, really what they're doing is they're trying to find reasons to disqualify you or to qualify you for the job. And again, every law firm that has an opening is interested in hiring you because they need someone to do a certain type of work. And if they're not having that work done, you're losing money. So there's a financial demand to hire you. There's all sorts of reasons that they want to hire you, but there's just certain things that people do that tend to mess up getting interviews. So, these are just a few like very simple things, but people mess them up all the time. You have to have the camera directly facing you. Sometimes people will do things like they'll put up their picture and not have their Zoom camera, and that will disqualify you from most jobs. They will not hire you if you decide to put something else up instead of actually being there. And then another thing that's important that people often don't do and also gets them disqualified for jobs is they will wear, they won't put a suit on because I think it's a Zoom call, and so they don't need to do that. But you absolutely need to dress up for the interview, look as best as you can, because that conveys respect to the firm. And if you don't do that, you're going to have a hard time getting hired. And then in terms of backgrounds, like, I have a business background that I use when I talk to people. I certainly never would, show where I'm working behind me or whatever. You can download just solid colors for backgrounds, like, brown background or whatever color background you're comfortable with. But it's really not the best to show where you work or your workspace or your house even, because, people can reach conclusions about you from that. I had a guy that was a partner, and he, wasn't getting jobs, even though he had several interviews, and I couldn't figure out why. And then I realized that he had a background that just showed his kitchen, and this kitchen was just like a mess. There was just all this stuff all over, and that really didn't, help him get interviews. I mean, a big mess in your kitchen with, fast food bags and things is not going to get you an offer. Law firms don't like that. In general, this is just kind of a point of advice. There are certain attorneys that buy into the fact that, if your office is messy or, and that sort of thing, then that's a sign that probably maybe your thinking's messy, and they don't like that. So it's always a good idea to have a neutral background. And it's the same thing with in-person interviews. One of the big things is just that I would, throw out to you is you always need to look the best as you can as well, but maintaining eye contact is important. Bringing your resume with you is important, and not looking down and that sort of thing, because you're really being evaluated in the interview if you are the sort of person that could basically relate to clients. And how would you relate to clients if you're looking down and not really and not connecting with them? So you need to make eye contact, you need to be strong, look strong, and need to do those things. And then obviously, before any interview, you want to make sure that, every interview that you find out who the attorneys are that you've been meeting, and then you read about the firm, you understand their practice compared to what, you're doing. You try to find things that are similar to the work that you're doing, or you just have a lot of enthusiasm for things that you haven't done and really would like to get involved in that kind of work. So understanding the work, figuring out ways that you would fit into that work. You can give answers that you like to do a certain type of work, and you don't have to mention that you read the bio and so forth. But if they're doing that kind of work, then that's very important. I will talk later in this presentation about seeking, what the reasons you should give for seeking a new opportunity. This part of the presentation, by the way, is very crucial. This is the number one thing that law firms ask about. So I'm going to go into some detail about this. Every law firm wants to know why you're looking, and you have to give extremely good answers for that. I'll go through several of them that are important that you should be giving. But this question is crucial. It's number one thing that people often get disqualified for. And, remote work, sometimes you're asked about that. And you just say things along the lines of, I'll do whatever you want. When they ask you about salary, by the way, sometimes people will, blurt out their salary requirements that don't even match what the firm is paying. And, again, you want to say something along the lines of, hey, I would like to be making what similar attorneys in my position would be making, in this position. So, what other people are paid. So that's the only answer to give. And then you talk about being, more interested in the work than your salary. And that's very important. But one thing that I want to just bring up too about salary related questions and why this is such a kind of a landmine. Your first 5 years of practice are really about getting experience in a practice area, and getting paid to do so it's just sort of almost like a side effect. You are not a competent attorney in any practice area until you've been doing it for at least 5 years. So any break in your employment where you're not getting trained in that practice area is always very, very hurtful and harmful to you. So you do not want to have any break, and you want to get 5 years of experience in a practice area. One of the reasons that's so important is once you have 5 years of experience, there's very few people that graduated in your class year that have 5 years of experience. They've all gone and done other things, but there's not many of you. So, this means that, after 5 years of experience, you can almost always move to a better firm and get the salary you want, but you need to be, very, very focused on training and not money, because you are not a competent attorney in your practice area until you get 5 years of experience. So, disqualifying yourself from jobs, you don't have a lot of other options based on salary is very risky. So these are the 5 key questions that I go over with all my candidates. In this PDF, you can click on these and see videos and read more about, these different answers. But the first one is about, can you do the job? And typically, if a law firm is interviewing you, your background and experience looks as if you can do the work, and there's no issues with that. But the things you're going to be concerned about is, your ego. Like, will you not do certain types of things that they need? Will you expect advancement in a certain length of time? Will you want to work remotely when they want everyone in the office? I mean, I saw a guy recently that got an offer for, I think it was like $450,000 to work for a firm. And he'd gone through a series of interviews, and he was currently making like $250,000. So it was just an amazing job for him. And he asked the question after he got an offer, if remote work was available, maybe like 1 or 2 days a week, because he had to commute over an hour to get to the office. And the law firm received that, and they just said, boom, we're done. And it was crazy because that job could have changed his life. But when he did that, they had the opinion that he wasn't someone that could do the job, because every person in that office was expected, to come in. So being able to do the job means a lot of things. It means your experience. It means your willingness to do a certain type of work, and your willingness to do whatever they ask you to do. So I've seen attorneys turn down work because they wanted to work only in one practice area and get fired. I mean, there's all sorts of things that you need to do to look like you can do the job. So I would really highly recommend reviewing the article at the beginning of this PDF. And also, when you review the article, making sure that you read the attachment about the message to Garcia in your career. That will transform the way you get jobs. There is no reason or nothing wrong with turning down a job that doesn't match what you're looking for. But they are looking for people that are going to get in there and do what they need to do, not ask a lot of questions, not make things about them. And really, that's one of the most important components of getting a job. When you're interviewing with firms. The next one is your ability to commit to the job. So commitment means that you want to go someplace and not leave. And I will talk again in this presentation a little bit later about commitment and how important it is. But law firms want to believe that if they hire you, it's exactly what you need to commit, and you want to stay there, and you're not going to mess around by looking for other jobs or potentially, leaving, early on because you want a higher salary, whatever like that. It means that, you're there, you want to be trained, you want to get some downs, and it's important for you to be at that place and commit. And I will tell you that this is one of the biggest red flags of firms when they're interviewing people, because they sense that that person may not commit or may not stick around. If you have a lot of moves on your resume, that's never a good idea. Having moves on your resume is a sign that you're unlikely to stay at your next firm because, for whatever reason, that's moving is in your DNA. And every time you move, it's going to affect your ability to get a lot of other jobs. So law firms want to believe that it's important to you to stay wherever you go, and that you will stay. And the reason for that is it takes a lot of time to get you up to speed on whatever types of matters you're doing. There's training that's involved, there's client relationships that can be disturbed. If you leave, it also can undermine the people that are currently working there, because they'll think, oh, that person's leaving, there's something wrong. So you really always need to do whatever you can to commit to whatever position, or you're interviewing for, and frame your moves in that way. And again, I will go into more detail about that later in the presentation. The other thing that's very important is your ability to be managed. So, that means that, whatever the law firm is asking you to do, you're able to, you will commit to that and stick around for a long period of time. And manage means you're not going to question assignments. You're not going to make things about your ego. You're not going to be the kind of person that sides on behalf of, people that are against the employer and think bad things about it. And there are people like this in every firm. In every firm, there's always a percentage of people that, have issues with the firm for whatever reason or another. They go into offices and close doors. Partners can pick that up very, very quickly. And when they do, you're kind of on the outs. I've had so many candidates that have questioned the need for assignments, have done things along those lines, and lost their jobs because they just weren't people that did what the law firm really wanted them to do, and they sided with other people that were against the law firm. And that's the job of the law firm, by the way, is really to sift out the kind of people that are against the law firm or won't do what the law firm wants. This is a high percentage of people that are let go from law firms. So you need to always be managed at your current firm and also others. Your job is to be a soldier and to do what you're asked, and never, be someone that looks like they're against management and gossiping and, doing that sort of thing. It's just not something that you need to do. And you need to be extremely careful in all of your interviews not to do that. I mean, it's crucially important, and also where you go to work. Anytime you side against your employer, the employer will pick it up and they will get rid of you and pick someone else. So it's just crucial. And who would you want to make partner if you were a law firm? You would want someone that would do what the firm wants and not question. That doesn't mean you can ask questions after you get the job, but it does mean that you need to really be very, very focused on, what the law firm wants, and someone that's always going to be on the side of management. And these sort of people, by the way, even if you don't get business, like in a law firm, there are people in every major law firm that never got business, but, are committed, aren't leaving, that will do what people ask them to do, that have the technical skills, and law firms will keep them around because these people are rare. And they will get work, and they will get work at the firm because the law firm thinks it's too much of a risk to get rid of someone who's committed, who does the work and so forth. And so this is something that can protect you your entire career. It's the same thing with partner. Partners also are managed by the firm, and they talk in terms of what the partnership wants, what their other partners want. So this is just something that you need to learn about your entire career and make sure that you're doing, that you're always looking as if you could be managed and acting like people just want that. They want to be able to tell you what they need, the way things are, and have you do the work. And this is something that they're looking for in all interviews, meaning that you can do that. This is something also that you need to be able to talk about when you go into interviews. Then one of the next things that so many people do wrong in interviews that always gets them booted out of the interviews is acting like the law firm needs to answer all these questions, that they're interviewing the law firm, that that they need certain things, questioning different types of things that the law firm is doing, acting like they can't do the job. But you just need to come into every interview and act like you really want the job. I mean, incredibly important. You say, this is exactly what I want. This is an opportunity that enabled me to. But I've always you talk in terms of that. So very, very important that you act like you want the job, that you're enthusiastic, that you can do it, and you need to get yourself psyched up before an interview. I don't know how you do it. I mean, sometimes what I would recommend is sitting down and writing something out for 20 minutes about the reasons you want this job, the reason work matches what you want, just kind of getting yourself psyched up and thinking about the reasons that you want the job. Now, I'll tell you a story, and it's actually kind of interesting. And I talk a lot. I've talked about this. I don't know if maybe I've talked about it before, but I had a candidate that was from Skadden Arps in New York, and she was making $370,000 a year or something. and her husband needed to relocate to West Virginia. And I don't know what the city was. It was like Martinsburg or something. And I submitted her to, a bunch of different firms there. And these firms didn't pay well at all. I mean, they paid like, 60,000 or 80,000. I don't know. It was just nothing anywhere near what she made at her previous jobs and her previous job. And, she went into each of these interviews and just blew people away. Like, she's like, I really want this job. Like, this is, perfect for me. I'm moving here. Like, this is just awesome. I love the kind of clients you work on. I could add this value to what you're doing. And, she didn't go in as someone that was depressed about opportunities. She went in someone that actually convinced all these firms to hire her. And that gave her, several offers to consider. And also, because she had several offers, it gave her the ability to negotiate salary and so forth. And a lot of people would go into these types of interviews and act like, this firm's beneath me and all that sort of thing. And don't, and that's why she succeeded, probably also in getting a job at Skadden Arps. She hadn't gone to a top 25 law school, but in person, she just was like, this is everything I want. Like, this is perfect. And this is how people behave, even when they're getting jobs that are beneath them. Because your job going into every interview is just to get the job. Like, you're not there to like question the firm or act like you don't want it. Like, you get the job, and then you have leverage. You can negotiate with other firms later, and it's very you need to do that. You need to act like you want every job, even if you don't, because your job is to get the job. And once you get the job, if you have questions about the job and you don't think you have other offers, you can negotiate. And this is what we do for candidates all the time, and it works. And then the other thing about being likable is really putting yourself in a situation where, you realize that every person that you're interviewing with could potentially be, someone that's going to hire you. I mean, could potentially be, someone that could change your life. So, you want to act like you really want the job. You want to try to build rapport with the interviewers. You want to smile. You want to act, connected. You could sometimes, I'll talk more about this later, have some vulnerability that you show. But, this, being likable means doing your best to build a connection, not being, depressed about interviewing for the job, not, being really someone that's likable. And one of the best, I tell this analogy a lot of times, but it's very, very true. When I was young, like maybe 8 or 9 years old, my mom took me to look at puppies for sale. And there were like, 10 puppies or whatever. And one of them just ran up to me and started licking me. He was very enthusiastic and jumped on my lap and stuff. And that was the one that I chose, even though it wasn't the biggest dog. Didn't have the best colors and everything, but it was the most enthusiastic. It liked me the most. That works. I mean, if you act like you like someone, they're going to want to hire you. So, you try to figure out, how can I like every person I meet? You realize how important it is. And that's, very, very important. All these things. And so this, what I've talked about here is really what I go through with each candidate. If you read these articles, I'm going to send links to you to this, and you're able to be likable and do all these things, you're going to have a much better chance of, getting a position. There's lots of questions you can answer. I'm not going to go over questions in this presentation today because there's a ton of them. And I will do a presentation about these probably next week on Wednesday. But really, the most important question, people ask a lot of BS questions like, what do you like most about the firm and stuff. This is okay, but people can see through kind of BS questions. The question that seems to get people the most offers and jobs is, asking what success is going to look like, the first 60, 30, whatever, 90 days. That means that you're really motivated to do things the way they want things done. And it gives you the chance, when they give you an answer, to talk about, how you could do those things and you would achieve those things. You would make that important. And it makes you seem like someone who wants to do a good job instead of asking questions about salary and just all this other stuff, which isn't going to help you. So this question alone really can change the course of your interview. So again, I will send this PDF to you. This is something that's fairly short because I do not have, I don't spend a lot of time talking to candidates about, all the different things I'm going to cover with you today. But if you take time to review this, you'll see kind of the most important landmarks that you're going to have that are going to come up in interviews. Let me just go through, some of these other rules that are important. Now, this is a book, And we used to sell it on Amazon. We got lots of, for $39 or something. And then we decided to take it off there just because for various reasons. And now we share with candidates, all this stuff that I'm going to talk about right now are kind of, the common landmines that that people run into. When you give answers to questions, you cannot, give long answers. You have to be concise. That's what lawyers are expected to do. They don't sit there and talk for a client for 30 minutes about something. They try to be like succinct. This is what you're taught in law school. So you don't want to give long answers. Long answers, often the more you say, the more reasons you give the law firm to reject you. And in addition, in any personal interaction you ever had, if someone starts talking and says long-winded answers, you're going to get bored. So people will like you the most when they're able to do about 80% of the talking. It always works. There's a story about one of my mentors, Jay Abraham, and he was on a plane, and he just had this idea when he sat next to someone that to make his, just thinking about ways to talk about, to get people interested. He sat there and asked them next to him questions for the full 3-hour flight, and didn't really give any answers about himself at all. And at the end of the flight, the guy sat up and said that he was talking to, this has been the most interesting conversation that I've ever had. I want to be, I'd love to stay in touch and all this sort of stuff. So people love it when you let them talk. And frankly, the smartest people often do the least talking. In my career, I've hired several graduates of Harvard Law School, Stanford Law School, and they've come to work at our company. And I've always noticed with the people that are the smartest, they tend to do more listening, talking, because they can pick up a lot of information. And it's also, a skill that you can learn, but it's very, very, important. So some other things about here. One of the other things that people do in interviews is they think that they need to not tell the truth about various matters. Now, talking about why you left your previous position, I'll get into it in a little bit detail, but you really need to, be honest with people, and not, just not try to go into a lot of detail about things and exaggerate. If you exaggerate, people always will realize that makes you look bad. It's actually much better to be vulnerable than to not to do something else. So then again, listening is important. Sometimes even paraphrasing things back. So this is like a very good skill that a lot of therapists learn when they're in school, psychologists, and you paraphrase what the person said back to them to show that you understand it, have interest in the firm. That often helps you quite a bit. Here's some of the biggest traps to look out for. I've written a lot about this, and I think that when attorneys that I work with are for whatever reason they've read things that I've written about it, and now I don't see this as much. I see it very rarely, but being careful about saying things negative about your employer is a hugely important things. A lot of people may be angry at their current employer. They may have issues with their current employer, but your statements always need to be something along the lines of I really like the people there. Work was great. That sort of thing. You need to come across is very, very loyal to your current employer, that you like them. These are some things that you can answer that question. That when people ask you why you're looking, you can say you want a more team-oriented environment, which obviously isn't one of the best answers. Sometimes you can talk about a commute. So there are people that drive an hour or more to work each day. Not wanting to do that is a good reason for leaving. If you don't have the time, you're losing potential billable hours, and you just can't do the commute anymore. It's too much for you. And so law firms like that, if you're interviewing with a firm that's closer to you, which you should always try to do, you could talk about wanting more responsibility, which is not the best answer, but it's something you can say. But one other thing that I think is also very important is and this works. I've seen this work more times than I can imagine. This is something that will separate you from 95% of the other applicants. If you say you've always wanted to work for the company that you're interviewing with. I had a candidate the other day. He was in insurance defense, and there was a firm he got an interview with, which was for product liability and mass torts, which is actually a better job in terms of exposure to larger clients, just different types of things. He happened to grow up with a friend of his who was a partner at this firm, who he knew, from the time he was young. And that partner had always spoke, enthusiastically about the firm. So he went into his interview and he talked about, how he'd always wanted to work for that firm. And it immediately, separated him from everyone. And they took him and made him an offer very quickly. So, I always wanted to have work for a firm, and then having good reasons for doing it is a good, very good answer. Talking about, I don't know why this says company, it should be firm, but I'm talking about no room for advancement. I mean, that's not as great of an answer, but if there's reasons for that, meaning the firm never makes partners, that it's whatever, that the firm just doesn't have opportunities, it's also a very good answer you can get, and that works. And another thing that works very well is if you are in a position where you're getting an interview with a larger firm. Larger firms typically will work for larger clients. They'll have more resources. You'll be exposed to more sophisticated work, which means you can go into more depth. So, talking about that is just awesome. You say, I normally would interview, but I found out about this opportunity, and I'd really like to work at a larger firm, and that works very, very well. In addition to that, talking about how, you may be working in multiple practice areas at the moment, and you want to focus in on one practice area, another good one. For attorneys that are interviewing with smaller firms, then you talk about how you much prefer to work at a smaller firm because of the collegiality or whatever the reasons are. But you have that answer when you go into firms. And people work in smaller companies because they can be more collegial. The partnership is, more tightly knit. I mean, there's all sorts of reasons. And then you can say that the new firm is going into direct exciting for you, or, you've heard good things about the firm through other attorneys there, and you wanted to apply to the firm because of that. And you normally wouldn't be applying, but you heard so many great things that you want to apply. So each of these answers is, very important and something you should go into detail. You should go prepared to answer when you're asked about why you want to leave. But talking about firm's toxic, talking about the firm's having all these financial issues, things like that are not things that you should bring up. I mean, you should bring up these sorts of stuff, these issues when you're interviewing. And I will go into more detail about some of these responses and how they work a little bit later in the presentation. So, salary and benefits are important to, any person looking for jobs. Firms pay what they pay. They often pay below market, but, bringing that up is not something you ever do. You wait for them to tell you what their, what the law firm pays them. And law firms, by the way, most of them, with the exception of, the largest firms, are negotiable. So you can actually negotiate a salary if you're not positive about being there after you have gotten an offer. So, here's some, questions that people ask that, tend to disqualify them. They'll ask about, how many hours they can work. They'll ask about, things related to, how much they work. Just 1 second. I'm sorry. Yeah. Sorry about that. I'm having the exercise not fixed. They just came. I had to do that. So, other questions would be like, how long until I get a raise or promotion? Those are not good questions. Again, working remotely, something they don't like. One of the things that gets almost every man disqualified when he asks it, if the firm has a maternity leave policy. Law firms don't like that. And then also asking about vacation and that sort of thing will tend to get you disqualified. And then asking questions about whether or not the firm will challenge you in the position. When you ask questions like that, you're showing that you may not necessarily be interested in staying there long term, the kind of things you want. So that's the most important thing to look at. Sometimes I'm not going to get too much information about this, but just appearing defensive and angry. Sometimes people are defensive in interviews too often, but you need to do that. Sometimes people will give too much information. These are some examples that I've seen. Obviously talking about health issues, talking about going to AA or whatever. Anything that's like that. It's not good. Here's some of the common ones that people will bring up. We'll talk about church or religion. We'll talk about, being very involved in, in one political party. So, putting things so that you're a Democrat or Republican or whatever on your resume is not a good idea because, the firm could be all Democrats and you might be a Republican, or the firm could be, whatever. And I hope you talking about political campaigns on your resume for different politicians or whatever can also get you in trouble, because you have to remember that there's so much divisiveness in the country about, people that are Democrats and Republicans, and they kind of hate each other. So, you never would want to put yourself on the side of, one of those politicians. It's just very, political parties, it's just very, dangerous. You don't talk about having got fired jobs. You don't talk about, things like things that you made, whether you were rich or wealthy. You don't die. That sort of thing. Another thing that you don't want to talk about is any, hospitalizations for diseases, hospitalizations for, having gotten sick and gotten better. You have, it's not that there's anything wrong with having been sick or anything, but if you bring that up, then the law firm's going to think, well, is this person with a chronic sickness or whatever? Is that going to the performance? And you kind of put yourself in a position where, even though I'm assuming it's discriminatory, where they have to choose with someone that may have health problems as opposed to someone that didn't. A lot of times people will bring up disabilities. I've had candidates that, have disabilities and they bring them up in the interviews. And again, there's nothing wrong with having disabilities, but if you do have, you need to be careful about making them, about getting a job in the firm. It's just not, because again, they're going to often, if they have choices, even though it's discriminatory, they're comparing to other people. You just have to be very, very careful. Medical diagnosis. I've seen, I've had the experience of just 1 second. I'm sorry. Okay. And then sometimes I've seen women list, that they've been raped or whatever. Again, terrible. But I had a woman that was from Stanford Law School not too long ago and had these rape crisis things on her resume. And it's just there's nothing wrong with that. But when you're going into a job, you don't want to make an issue of, you want to just look like the person who's most qualified for the work. People will often list their sexual orientation on their resume. Law firms certainly are interested in hiring that sort of, people with different sexual orientations, but you need to be careful about making that an issue on your resume for the same reason. There could be discriminatory people inside of a law firm, and I'm not criticizing that, and you just need to be careful. Anything that has nothing to do with your ability to do a good job in the position, taking sides on social issues, making anything an issue that doesn't have anything to do with your ability to do a good job that could alienate people. You just need to, not mention it. It's just, you can, list yourself or your sexual orientation later if you're hired, but you want to be, very careful of that, because you don't know the kind of person that's reviewing your resume and what they're like. You just want to get the job and make it everything about your ability to perform the job. That's basically it. So, people, go into interviews many times and they will talk about, personal things as if the interviewer's their friend. They'll talk about, weaknesses and things and kind of unload about their personal things in an interview. That doesn't work. So the interviewer is really there to screen you about the things that I mentioned earlier. So you need to be very careful about that. So, there's all sorts of things that, catch people off guard in interviews. Sometimes people will say, they'll say the job requires travel, and then you may get caught off guard. But again, your job is to get the job. So you can negotiate all this stuff later. But, if they say the job requires a lot of work, if they say our attorneys work on the weekends, and you may not like that, of course, different responsibilities that you might not be aware of. So they may expect you to do the type of work that you feel is below your kind of your skill area. And if that happens, you need to be careful. And, you just need to make sure that nothing catches you up. Everything is about getting the job and moving to the next level, and that's creating doubt you wouldn't do the work that the firm wants. Once you have an offer, it just gives you a lot more confidence in the job market, and you don't have to like every offer, accept every offer, but you need to do, everything you can, to get the job. I talked a little bit earlier about long-winded answers. Every time you say a lot of stuff, you may give the attorney reasons not to hire you. Sometimes you'll just say things inadvertently, but you want to give very, succinct answers that give them enough, information about what you do. I mean, about their question that's direct and it doesn't go into a lot of detail. I've seen people, that were talkers and would just give these long answers, and that the law firm is never going to hire you if you do that. You can often tell if you're giving a long answer that people are getting bored. I mean, they don't want to hear long answers. The interviewer actually wants to do the most talking, so you need to be careful about that. And then obviously, understanding the firm before you go in, things that you can find online that you don't need to ask about. That's very important. Sometimes people will go into firms and they will ask, they'll be kind of desperate for a job, and we'll talk about why they're desperate. And that just, doesn't go over well, because the law firm is going to want to hire people that aren't desperate and can do the job, and other people are interested. One of the things that gets law firms' attention a lot is we may have a candidate that has been submitted to, say, 30 firms or jobs in BCG, and they get an interview, and then we email the firms that haven't interviewed the candidate, and we say, this person's getting a lot of interest, would you be interested in interviewing them? And all of a sudden you look like a much stronger candidate, or there's demand for you in the market, and they're like, what are we missing here? We should have brought this person in. And then in response to that sort of follow-up, the candidate may end up getting 2 or 3 interviews that they wouldn't have gotten otherwise. So looking like there's a lot of interest in the market in you, and you're a very strong candidate, is much more important than you just can't portray any type of weakness. You need to look like someone who's very strong. I mean, one of the things you need to think about in any time you're interviewing is that as a candidate, you may, you want to look like someone that a lot of people want. If you look like someone that no one wants, then the law firm isn't going to want you either, because they're going to think that other people are seeing someone in this candidate that we're not seeing. So a lot of times also people, won't ask questions, and they'll say, I think I've heard all I need to hear. You need to ask, questions about, what you can do to be good in the job, what you can, how soon, are you going to make a decision is often also a good one. You just need to be, the questions need to be related to, how good of a job you'll do. Other people will go into interviews and they will exaggerate, and they will exaggerate matters. Most of the time, a law firm can tell when you're exaggerating. So we want to be very careful about that. You don't want to say you did more types of work than you did it, than you didn't. You just be honest. If you're honest, then firms are going to be much more, interested in you, because they're going to trust you, and they're going to believe that everything, you say is true. And they like that. People, you can go into an interview, and I had a candidate recently that got a position, and he was working at an accounting firm, and he was going into the interview with a position at a law firm. And his experience, he didn't really have as much experience as they needed, and he was interviewing, with someone that they needed that experience. He only had a little bit of that experience, but he went in and he was honest, and they liked him. And instead of asking, questions about, instead of him trying to act like he had all this experience, he was very, very honest, and they liked that, and they hired him. And I think he was 3 or 4 years out of law school, and they hired him as a second-year attorney, which was outstanding. He didn't really have any law firm experience. And so being honest really can help you. You also, don't want to talk about, other places you may be interviewing. Firms don't like that. Sometimes they'll ask you, and if you tell them, if you aren't interviewing in other places, then you say, I'm only applying to a few places. I applied here because, I think, this is a really good place for me. And so being able to do that, I wanted this, I saw this job, I thought it was perfect. Don't talk about other places, you're available. Just as a quick note, not all law firms will check references. It tends to happen at the smaller firms for some reason, or mid-sized firms. But when you go in an interview, if a law firm says anything about references, you need to be able to, talk about their references, and so you should always have your references printed up. People that go into interviews and they carry their resume with them, and they carry their references, always looks very, very good. It looks like, you're kind of on it. The cell phones are another big deal. I had a candidate recently that was from Las Vegas, and he was a trademark attorney, but didn't really have that great a trademark experience. And he did kind of this national search looking for jobs. And incredibly, he got an interview with a firm that wasn't too large, and well, actually, it was a large firm. Sorry, in North Carolina, and he went out there, and they flew him out for the interviews. They did a couple of Zoom calls before they brought him out. He didn't have any other interviews. I mean, he was just kind of this guy that didn't have a lot of trademark experience. I mean, not very sophisticated, but he got an interview with his firm, which I honestly couldn't believe. And so he was there. They brought him out for 2 days. His first day, they had like a bunch of people interviewing him. Everything went really well. And then the next day, before he left, they took him out to lunch. And during the lunch, he was playing with his phone. Like he just, a couple times during the lunch, he looked down at his phone. It wasn't really available for conversation. And because of that, even though, prior to lunch, he was going to get hired. But then he did this texting and they felt very offended and didn't make him an offer. So, if you have the ability, just turn off your cell phone anytime you're interacting with the firm. This gets so many people. I mean, I have, example after example of people that this happened to throughout the years, but you need to be very, focused. So I'm not going to talk about, tell me a little bit about yourself. I did a long webinar on that a couple of weeks ago, so that is not something I need to talk about, in terms of finding information about the firm. I mean, it's really not too difficult. You can just go to the firm website. It's often useful to read articles. So sometimes law firms will do press releases, or newspapers will report on different things that they've done. And so being aware of that when you go to an interview is great. And, will give you more reasons to find out, how things work. Now, I'm going to talk about right now a very important point. And this is probably, in terms of what I've talked about so far today, one of the most important points you can understand. And if you understand this, you're going to do, very, very well in your interviews. One of the problems with lawyers and the way they think, it's a positive thing, a negative thing. But as I'm sure you're aware from law school and your seasoned attorney where you've worked, I mean, lawyers are programmed to look for weaknesses. They want to, find weaknesses in their opponents, whether it's, in corporate law, finding, weaknesses in different types of things, or in litigation where people are just writing back and forth on different people's weaknesses. And so, as an attorney, you need to be able to understand the psychology and how that works. I mean, there are cases where, literally, I watched a documentary about it, a case where someone chopped off someone's head, and it was documented, and everyone knew he did it, and the attorney ended up getting him off based on, finding weaknesses in whatever case. So, every attorney will use whatever arguments they possibly can to, sorry, this is a mess in normal position. So understanding, that's what attorneys do. Attorneys in their role are basically paid to find weaknesses and protect their clients. And so, there's all these kind of things that happen in the legal profession. Attorneys are expected to do a really good job for their clients. Attorneys, law firms do not, it's almost, built into the psychology of law firms. I never heard once in my career an attorney, talk negatively about their clients. They're there to take the client's side. That's what they do. They don't talk about weaknesses, and they do everything they can to do that. That's the psychology. So this is what attorneys have been paid to do, for hundreds of years. So if they don't do that, then they're not, considered, they're not considered good attorneys. And so as an attorney, you need to be in a position where you're portraying strength, not weakness. And that happens, with attorneys, with candidates you're representing all the time. You need to be in a position where, you're portraying yourself as strong, competent, and not someone who's weak. And so if you go into interviews and you bring up all sorts of weaknesses and that sort of thing, or you don't answer questions in a way that is spun to be very strong, then you're not going to be, considered, a good attorney. So you need to be able to spin everything that happens with you, or everything in your background, to be a better attorney. So, you may be going in an interview with a firm that's a good firm that you normally get a job with, and, saying something along the lines of, I didn't realize I didn't go to the most prestigious law school, but because of this, I need to work harder, I'll live, breathe, and eat, and sleep this job. I really want this job is something, a way that you can spin that sort of information. So you always need to be able to spin information in a way that makes you look very, very strong. So right now I'm going to talk about something that is a little, difficult, not difficult to understand, but is a little odd. But, I'm going to talk about kind of how, attorneys, businesses work and how legal careers also work. So, what'll happen, with a new business if it's able to take off is it will typically, if it's a good business, it will start growing and at some point, what happens, people that are better, that are more innovative, that are young, they come in and business that usually will start going down. Like its revenues after some point will innovation, hard work, and all this sort of stuff will start to go down. So when that goes down, then very few people, businesses, that's a little to go back. That's one reason why people retire at a certain age. It's because they're not innovating anymore and things and positive things, that they're not able to to continue being strong. And this pretty much happens to all businesses. So if you look at like just recently, like Intel, like used to be a huge business, and it's reached the point where it's not innovating and its revenues are going down. It's arguably happening to Apple, where they're not really coming out with new products. I think they came out with some headset recently that just was a flop that they thought was a great new product, and so all businesses are eventually under attack from competitors, and they end up going down. Even something like Google, like yesterday lost this antitrust case. So all businesses typically grow and then they experience some sort of decline. Happening with Tesla. It's just every business, starts out very strong, and then a lot of the innovation stuff, stops happening. So, businesses can also innovate and get away from that, but it often doesn't happen. There was a story about, I don't know when the first Fortune 500 started, I don't know if it's in the 60s or something, but, if you look, like back in the 1990s, there were only a few companies that were around. I mean, out of the 500 companies, most companies will eventually stop innovating and they will go out of business. So that's something to think. Now I'm going to talk about this in the prospect of you in terms of what you need to do when you're working. So when attorneys start out in large law firms, a high percentage of them will not have the skills or work ethic or manageability or whatever it is to stay there. So so that's be someone that starts high and then goes down. Other attorneys may last 7 or 8 years, and then they go into a position where they're taking a less prestigious job. Other attorneys may become partners, but then at some point they also start tapering off, and other attorneys will continue growing in their 60s and 70s. If you think about what happens in most law firms, not all, but to most attorneys, is that they will start in a firm and they will often start going down and not improving. And you need to think about this at any firm or any career move you have. Are you effectively moving up for some reason? And are you, at this point where you're continually growing, or are you going back? And this is a very, very important point. So I want, anytime you take a job, you have to understand, are you moving up in that S curve, or are you moving down? Because once you start moving down, it's very, very difficult to move up. And you always want to be in a position to be moving up. And if you're not moving up, that is going to create quite a few problems for you in your career. I'm giving you 1 second. Thank you. We'll call you. Okay. Give me 1 second. I've done a webinar like this where I was interrupted so many times. So here's the thing. So with companies, that are, companies that are in business, and again, this is all going to relate, back to your career. But when a company starts going down, like it's not improving and not generating more revenue and so forth, then it's kind of, people will start selling the stock. If you start a company and you've got, venture capitalists, and then you want to get more investment, the company always needs to be improving, and it needs to be bringing in more and more revenue. If it doesn't do that, then that company, if it's relying on funding for people, will go out of business. And that's what happens to most companies that start. They start very strong, and then, at some point there's just not a product market fit, and then they start going down. So, lawyers, are the same way. So, I've dealt with, venture capitalists before. I remember at one point I was selling this company, Law Crossing, for $60 million. And I had met, spent months meeting with these private equity people and had done a lot of work, on that. And then one of them actually flew out to meet me from New York at dinner. And he was like, okay, this is great. We're going to do this. And then he asked me to send him, I don't know, some updated traffic information and, signups or something. And those numbers had gone down. There was less traffic and the revenue, the signups had gone down, not by a lot, but, after, probably literally like 6 months or 8 months of meeting with these people on several occasions, they just pulled the plug and never heard from them again because that stuff was going down. Excuse me. And no one wants to invest in a company that's going down. They just don't. And it's like that for people. So, law firms want to hire attorneys that are going on the way up. That's just how it works. If you look like you're going down, that's very unattractive. So you need to look like you're going up. Almost every placement that I make of the attorney, I frame whatever position they're applying for is something that represents them moving up and not moving down, not looking desperate, not wanting to work someplace for reasons that are just kind of like they need a job or whatever, so they're going down. So this perception of avoiding weakness is extremely important in hiring. So, law firms, if you go to work, like I could take a candidate that's at like a very good, firm, whatever the firm is, and I send them to a less prestigious firm and no one, they're just not going to, they're not going to be interested if there's not compelling reasons for them going there because they know the person will leave or they know that there must be something wrong with them for wanting to work at a less prestigious firm unless there's positive reasons for that person moving. So this is literally one of the most important things in the legal career. Like people do not want to see attorneys that are portraying weakness. I think the reason it's so great in legal career is because the legal industry is because you can't portray weakness for a client. Like your job is to portray as much strength as you can. And the entire legal profession, whether it's regardless of what you're doing, patent law, or insurance defense, or whatever you're doing, you have to portray strength, and you can't portray weakness. And if you do that, you're considered a bad lawyer. People just don't really about clients. They don't. They spend all their time portraying strength and not portraying weakness. So if you go into if you look like you're going down when you're talking to a firm or that you don't have positive reasons for being some other place, that's that might be not as good of a firm. Law firms do not like that. So they feel like you've given up. They feel, you need to portray every move, even if it's to a less prestigious firm, it's something that makes you, look like, you're on the way up. So, how do you make yourself, look like you're on the way up? These are the things that companies do. So, they're doing things that may lower prices, but that's not necessarily something you do when you're searching. Sometimes they'll change the design of the product, so, you can work on your resume. I've done a lot of webinars based on that. And then also, one of the things you can do that actually works very well, you can often move to other areas. If you move to other areas and you have you have reasons for being in another area, like your family's from there, or your spouse is from there, or you have some other sort of connection there. That's often a good reason. That's not necessarily considered a move down if you have good reasons, for moving. So these are some examples. If you're at a firm, small city, you want to go to a larger city, you can sell yourself on that, or whatever reason, cultural, different things like that. That can look like a good reason. You move into a firm that's more focused on your practice area. That's a good reason. Sometimes if you're in a branch office, you want to move to a main office of a firm because you believe there's more opportunities there. That's also a good reason. Partners can move for different reasons. So those are, some of the ways, you can do things. You have other options of places, sell locations, and so forth. But you really need to make sure that you portray every move and every person you're talking to as a move up. It has to be a move up. It has to be more focused on your practice area. It has to be moving to a smaller firm. You want to something that's more collegial or smaller, or a firm that's more focused in the practice area, or in a geographic location that matches what you want, or something about, or where just reasons to make the firm think it's a move up and not a move down. So just keep in mind that if you're a firm, I mean, you don't want to hire, losers. I mean, you want to hire people that are able to, look like they're going up. There has to be something about the move, even if it's to a less prestigious firm or something along those lines. You have to look like you're moving up, and you're just not taking a job for, various reasons. I was talking to a candidate yesterday, very interesting. He had gone to, I think he went to Harvard Law School, and he was in Silicon Valley working for the government and got an interview with a firm that did the same type of governmental work that he did. So, his explanation, which went over very well, he got hired within a month, was that he wanted to work in a law firm and, not in a government anymore. There's good reason. So, you need to, when you interview employers, you need to be able to, focus on reasons that whatever the firm is, reasons that you're moving up. And if you want to ask questions in the chat about this, that might be helpful. Like, how can you portray that? But you have to portray yourself as someone else. And it usually has to do with your practice area, like more expertise. It may have to do with, being in a firm that's more, more smaller, more collegial. It could be, whatever it is. You have to look like you're moving up. It has to be something about your current position that portrays you as moving up. So, people can say all sorts. You can say that the firm doesn't have enough work, or you could say, I want to work on larger clients, or whatever. You have to figure out, like, how do I look like I'm moving up? Because if your career starts to move down, like, that's the worst thing that can happen to you. And again, I'll just take a look, show you this curve again, because this is what happens to most legal firms. It happens to most attorneys in large firms. It happens to attorneys all over. Like, they start and they're just kind of on this growth path, doing very well. And then they get to a point where, they just kind of start going down. Like, what does going down mean? It means, like, you get to a point where you're 7 or 8 years in, you don't have clients, lose your job, and you have to, go in house and struggle for jobs. Or you get into a firm and, you lose a job for one reason, you get another job and you have problems there. And, like, so you always want to be on this position where you're moving up, and you need to be doing it, like, through your entire career. Now, there's nothing wrong with going in decline, but it's a fight. It's a fight, and you want to be always looking like you're on the way up. And law firms love that. I mean, they love, when you're moving up. I had a candidate that was interesting. What was his story? Anyway, he had started at a small firm. He'd gone to a good law school. He'd done okay there. He had lost his job. He didn't get an offer as a summer associate. He failed the bar a couple times, I think. And then he went and, he got a job at a small firm. He did as well as he possibly could. He developed all this expertise in his practice area. And then after that, he got another job at a little bit bigger firm, when he was able to sell his expertise, which he spent a couple of years developing. And he did 3, 4 moves. But on his 4th move, he ended up at, one of the best firms in the world. And then he got there and he continued focusing on this narrow niche in his practice area. And he's continually improving, so you could start out weak and improve, but, and that's really the goal. Like, that should be your goal. And your goal should be to not lose. You don't want to lose early in your career. You don't, if you're losing, middle of your career, you want to start going up, because, once you kind of hit this period of decline, you, as an attorney, you're kind of often out of business. And, your goal is to continually get more and more work, to be considered a better attorney, to get along with people, to do the things that the firm wants, and not to go into this downward trend. And, it's very hard for attorneys when people look at them like they have a downward trend. It doesn't look strong. You need to just look like you're constantly moving up. Talk to firms, you need to look like you're moving up. And this is should be your everything you do, like every move you make, every interaction you have in your own firm that could result in, you going down is very, very negative. I work a lot with people in New York City or Los Angeles, in Chicago and big cities. And all these big cities, if you're unemployed, it's very, very hard because, it looks like you're going down and people just avoid you. I mean, in New York City, if you want to get a job in a good sized firm and you're unemployed, it's next to impossible. So, I mean, they have plenty of people that are employed. There's no reason for them, when they can get tons of candidates for each job, to hire someone like that. So every move you make, and everything I've talked about today, your ego, your things that are important to you, your job is to go into a firm and do the best you can, and you can still get other jobs after that. But you really need to be in a position where, constantly moving up, because your competition is always other attorneys that are moving up, and law firms want attorneys that are moving up. It's just how it works. And, you can start moving down earlier in your career, which is horrible, and that's going to affect you. Law school doesn't teach you this, but you always want to be moving up. That's what people respect. People don't respect people that are moving down. And so moving down is just very, very, bad thing for you. So you need to look like everything you do, every move you made is a move up. So in 3 firms, you say, first firm, there wasn't this enough experience in this practice area, or I wanted to go to a firm that had bigger clients, whatever it is, you need to be moving up. And this is what happens to most attorneys. Most attorneys, like if I look at every day, I'll look at, I don't know, like 200 resumes that people send to BCG. You may be one of them. And, a couple things I look for. The first is just like a focus on a practice area, which most attorneys don't have. And I don't know why. They just have all these different things. And you really should be focused on one practice area, because that's what makes you marketable, because that's what clients are paying for. They're not paying for, jacks of all trades, or paying for experts, but they'll have that. And that eliminates a lot of people. But then, there'll be all these kind of moves that are down. And that can hurt you. I have one client that it was very interesting. He started at Skadden, and then he went and did 4 judicial clerkships in a row, like federal clerkships. So I still don't understand why someone would do that as a 4th-year attorney. And then the only job he could get was at an insurance defense firm, even having been at Skadden, because there wasn't like this, perception that he was moving up. And then he even got, like, at his new firm, he got, I don't know what it was, like a big amount of business, like $700,000. And it was not in his practice area. So he gave it to other attorneys, but he couldn't get any interviews because there was this kind of look, on his resume that he'd started off doing this incredibly sophisticated litigation. And then he'd done this stuff that had nothing to do with being a sophisticated litigator. I mean, maybe 1, but 4 is too much. And then the only job that he could get was insurance defense. And now, even though he's got this business, which is pretty respectable, but he didn't do the work, he's only been able to, he hasn't been able to get interviews, because he just looks like, first of all, he doesn't focus, like, why would you do all his clerkships? But, second of all, his resume suggests he's moving down. People don't like that. So, again, businesses will never invest, or, outside companies will never invest in someone that looks like they're on their way down. They just don't. So that's the most important thing, for you to think about, is like, what are you doing to package yourself as someone, who for some reason is, for whatever reason is moving up. Attorneys that, are in small markets or want to work in big markets, that's respected, looks like they're moving up. You need to be, how you need to make sure that you put yourself positioned, where you look like you're growing, so a couple other things that I will go into a little bit. There's not I'm going to put this book or send everyone that's on this webinar into a chat, but this is a story about when I was interviewing for positions, especially, but when I was in college, looking for positions, I remember I was interviewing, had done all this research and stuff that I thought was very interesting. I talked about that in my interviews, and that did not go over well. There's a couple more things that I wanted to talk about. Thank you letters about that today, and else to talk about. This is a very long book. It's like 150 pages. These are more kind of Q&A. So I think that's the majority, of things I wanted to talk about. But there's just a couple other basics here. You want to get to the firm obviously in time. You always want to give yourself like 30 minutes extra to get in there, despite all the traffic. That's important. Showing up late shows lack of commitment. That's about it. So a lot of this stuff, I'm going to talk about, I think, in another webinar, and the other things that kind of wanted to go over with you today. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the stuff, I think, in another webinar. This is a lot of information, but that's kind of what I wanted to cover today. So we'll take a quick break, and then, when I come back, I'll answer questions about the topics we've covered today. If you have any, and then you can also ask questions about any other things, related to your career. So just back like 1 to 2 minutes. If there's, a few issues here, I don't know if there's anything, that I can, a couple of things I could cover here just real briefly. I think this information is all pretty interesting, but I don't want to spend too much time with this stuff for everyone today. I'll cover it in another webinar because there's a lot of information. So I'll take a quick break so everyone can do whatever, And then when I come back, I will talk about this interview, some more about this interview stuff and kind of how to respond to questions. Thank you. Just give me 1 second. Screen share. Thanks everyone who's asking questions. I think personally that, this material is of course very interesting, but questions and answers are one of my favorite parts of my week, because I love hearing people's questions and answers, hopefully getting a good response to that. And I think, most of your questions are really, really good. So any questions you have would be awesome. So good to see you in a second. And so next week too, by the way, I'll go through some of the most common questions questions and answers that can be answered. I wanted to be respectful of everyone's time today, so I didn't want to go into too much detail about this stuff, but we also want to see if I can. Okay, so I think I don't have the ability here to put all this stuff in the chat. Let me see if I don't. Fortunately, Zoom as well as I should answer this question first. And by the way, like if you're signed into Zoom and your name is there, I won't do put your questions there. First, I want to thank you for this webinar. Converting interviews is like closing sales, a superpower. That's true. How would you suggest converting applications into interviews? So there's a couple of things you can do that I think are very important when you're applying for a position. A lot of times people will call the firm and have questions. You don't want to call the firm if you have questions. You typically want to do something you can to stick out. So one of the most important things I think, and no one does it, because no one does it. It's actually very powerful, is to mail your resume, like just print up an envelope, put it on nice paper, and then email your resume. And then also, in addition, and then email your cover letter to the firm with some reasons you'd like. The reason that's important is because what happens is law firms will typically get all these resumes that come in via email, and if there's 100 applications for a job, it's a lot of work to open up an email. And so if you're able to open up send something via mail, what happens is it arrives and it sits on someone's desk and they open it. And it's a much better way to stick out than to just, email your resume to whatever, put it through an applicant tracking system. Because if you do things that way, it's going to be very, very difficult for you to get the position. Another thing you can do too for your applications is I recommend that people reapply. So I had a candidate, it was kind of a fee dispute with a firm. But what had happened is I had sent the resume and they'd circulated the resume around, didn't want to interview the person. Then the person had applied again, a month later, and they'd forgotten about it. And they brought the person in, interviewed, and hired them. So literally applying to the same job twice helped them. I had another instance, I had a candidate, he was in Hawaii, and he had taken a job there, right out of Hawaii, doing something for the government, the prosecutor's office there or something. He had sent applications to 20 big firms in LA that he wanted to work with and hadn't heard any response whatsoever. He emailed his resume. And then I got involved 3 months after that, and I mailed this resume to the same firms, and he got 5 interviews. So he had applied on his own, didn't get interviews, but then when I mailed the resume, suddenly the firms paid attention. So, the biggest thing is, you can do always, if you can, mail your resume. And the other thing that I would recommend to anyone that's trying to get a position is I recommend that you apply more than once. There's nothing wrong with applying more than once. It shows interest. And I'd like to give, this is an example that I give a lot. I'll give it here right here about why it's important to apply is, you may, a lot of times when you apply, there may be, this is an example, there may be, when you apply here, there may be no interest because the law firm just is under pressure to hire anybody at that point in time. But if you apply at this point in time, suddenly, your application, they look at it. Or, if you end up applying, like this example would be here, if you apply, but if you apply here, for example, if you apply here, then you're more likely to get the job. So you should never give up when you apply to a firm, especially if you think they're a good fit for what you do. The more you apply, the more your odds are getting it. So this is something that I really, really recommend. I'll tell you one other story. I had a job for an in-house counsel years ago, and I was getting all these applications. People were just overwhelming me with sending me applications, and so at one point I got this crazy. I don't have time to review 200 email resumes. And this woman walked into my office, and she was older, she was probably mid-60s. She walked into my office and she had her resume and she said, can I give it to Harrison? Some front desk. She walked into my office with her resume and said, I know who you are, work for you. This is a great opportunity for me. Look at this job, I really want it. And so without even thinking about it, I hired her, and she was not a good attorney. She couldn't even write a cogent letter. But I felt badly, and I kept her on, and she got the job. The point is, anytime you do something that enables you to stick out, it really works. I remember I was at the University of Virginia, like for law school, and one day at the very beginning of school, I walked by, the admissions office, and outside the admissions office, there was like a couple people sitting there. And I was like, I came up to him, what are you guys doing? And he's like, well, I'm on the wait list, but I'm sitting here waiting, in case any positions open up or any, the firm doesn't fill their class. And then, one of those people, I remember, had this huge like wait list. The firm, the school brought in one and, admitted him, whereas if he was just one of the hundreds of applications on the wait list, I'm sure he wouldn't have gotten in. So, showing a lot of interest in the firm, doing things you can to stick out, is very, very important. This is a job about a recruiter opportunity, which I think is a great career for people. I think it's like moving up. This person, I will look for your application. And glad you're interested in it. Let's see here. More questions. These are all good questions. Each one of these questions, can really, very, helpful. So, and by the way, I'm going to send everyone a copy of the book, which we should sell for $40, and I'll send also the interview preparation guide that we only share with our candidates. I went over beginning. Okay, so this next question is: you spoke about the importance of aligning your responses with the firm's needs. How should I tailor my answer when I'm interviewing firms with different practice areas and cultures? What are some key indicators I should look for in the interview process that will help me customize responses on the spot? So again, the most important thing in the interview is to look like you're interviewing there because you're trying to look like you're trying to be, at a firm that is a better fit for what you want to do, that the firm is a perfect fit for, your interest, the culture, like whatever the firm has that you're interviewing with, it's important that you're able to do that. Now, there are some firms that are just desperate for people, and those firms, you may not have to go into all this sort of detail, but you need to make the firm feel important, that they're a good fit for you and what you're trying to do and accomplish. And you can figure out kind of what that is going into the interview. And, typically it's about the work, or it's about the size of the client, or it's about, being more focused in the practice area, or, whatever it is. You need to find reasons that firm is a very good fit for you. And you can typically do that by researching the firm before you go in, and by allowing the firm to do a lot of talking, and then try to customize your answers to that. So that's a good question. There's a lot of information that I might not have covered earlier, and that's important. Okay, so the next question is, let me see here. When preparing for an interview to reduce the impact of nervousness, how do I mentally prepare to reduce the impact of nervousness? Are there specific strategies and practices, such as visualization of breathing exercises, that are particularly effective for trainees who need to present strong, confident in front of your interviews? How do these techniques help in controlling anxiety? Okay, so that's a very good question. I had a candidate recently that was interviewing with a firm. He'd been fired from a good firm for failing the bar twice and hadn't had any interviews in quite a while, and then went into an interview and was shaking, so nervous. I had another one. A woman started crying during the interview, and this is not uncommon for people to have, anxiety and stuff during the interview, and dealing with that. So, how do you deal with it? Certainly, breathing exercises and meditation, I think, can help you with that. I think one of the things that I heard, like a piece of advice that was very, very good about how to avoid nervousness, was someone said that, when you're talking to people, instead of imagining them as these big, powerful people, you imagine them as like, children, that you're talking to, and that can make you more confident. So if you don't imagine them as big, powerful partners or whatever, you imagine them as children, and it just kind of makes the whole process a lot more fun. I'm certainly not going to recommend Xanax, other things, beta blockers, control anxiety. But, if you do have a lot of anxiety, just in general, that may actually be something that, psychiatrists or something can help that I would, think about that piece of advice, just imagining people interviewing whose children and just not being scared of them, when you're interviewing and be having anxiousness. So, just in terms of anxiousness, that's a very good point. The attorney that I told you, the first one that had lost his job twice, I had all this anxiety during this interview. He actually got the job. I spun it to the firm as, this is someone that really wants the job. That's why they're acting this way. Like, if you hire them, they're going to be very grateful and work hard. And, when this has happened, actually, more often than not, like 50% of the time, I'm able to spin it to the law firm. Like, this person really wants this. They'll work hard. They wouldn't be nervous if it wasn't important to them. So it actually sometimes works in your favor. But, if you're nervous, you say something along the lines of, I'm nervous, I really want this job. And that actually can go a long way. Like, people are like, respected, like, you really want to work there. So if you do find yourself getting really nervous and anxious, you can often say, I'm nervous, I really want this job. It's very important to me. There's so much I want, like, about this. I think, that actually can go a long way with, getting a position if you're able to, frame things that way. So anxiety can actually be good. Say, I'm really nervous about this next job. So I hope that answers your question. That's kind of how I would approach it. And also, if your anxiety is kind of ongoing, just talk to a doctor if it's something for it. I'm not talking about it sometimes. So sometimes I okay. And thank you everyone for asking these questions. I'm going to answer them all. And if you have additional questions, I'll answer those as well. Okay. So in your experience, what are the most common reasons that law firms cite for not hiring a candidate, even if they seem well qualified on paper? Are there particular traits or behaviors to the interview that can be more damaging to the candidate's prospect than a gap in experience? So yeah, attorneys make a lot of mistakes, and most firms, just so you understand, if they, I always look at the ratio of interviews to the people that we see. So it's very difficult to get an interview. I mean, if you send, the firm gets like 100 applications, they might interview one or two. So it's not, when you're submitting applications, and this is another thing. It's really a numbers game when you're looking at interviews and hiring people. I mean, it's just most often a numbers game. So you have to apply to a lot of places. That's, it's something that a lot of people don't understand. Beneath, the more firms you can apply to, the better your chances are. But when you get into an interview, like the most common mistakes, I think, are there's people that go into interviews and they just don't connect. They don't express enthusiasm. They just kind of sit there and, interview and don't give the firm a lot of reasons to hire them. And so that just doesn't go over well. Like, you have to go in and be like, you have to really want the job. You have to research that. You have to be very enthusiastic. You have to express your enthusiasm. But the people that don't get interviews, that's most often what happens. I mean, don't get jobs because they go in and they're just, if there's no particular reason the firm should hire them, they don't appear the kind of person that the law firm would want around the office. I mean, when law firms they're hiring associates. I mean, this is just kind of a general thing. Like, the partners want people that respect them, that are, going to jump up and down, try to help them, that are going to, make them feel important, like all these sorts of things. And so if you don't make the people you're interviewing with feel important, and you're going to do whatever they ask of you, and you're going to be want to do work, then the law firm isn't going to be that excited by you. They're just not going to want to, interview and hire you. So you need to, do whatever you can to look like you're, very enthusiastic and you want the job. And that's really one of the most important things I can recommend to you. You have to, really want the job and act like, you can't just sit there and interview and act like the firm's going to hire you or not ask questions. You have to be enthusiastic. People that don't get interviews just generally don't excite it. They don't get job. They don't come in and really want the job. They may highlight weaknesses in the interview, but the most common way is just to have a complete lack of enthusiasm. I had a candidate a few decades ago, and he just had no personality, no clear reason he wanted to work someplace, no real burning desire to do well, and just kind of expected things to happen to him. Even when he shook his hand, it was just kind of weak. And I felt very sorry for him. I actually ended up getting a job. Long story about that. But he would go into firms, and the firms were never send me anything like that again. So that's kind of the main behavior that turns firms off. You just have to really want the job and be focused and look like someone that is going to jump up and down and do the work, who really wants a job, because that's what people want. They don't want people that are going to, not be enthusiastic. They're just going to sit there and do the work, maybe not, continually want to improve and that sort of. That's one of the main things. These are great questions too, by the way. I appreciate everyone asking them, and I think please ask more. Any questions you have, I will answer. And one of the things I'd like to apologize for the webinar here, but I just want to respect everyone's time. So I will cover a lot of the additional issues that we can cover next week. Okay, so you mentioned that some law firms may have biases against certain types of candidates, such as those with non-traditional backgrounds or solo practitioners. How can a candidate with a non-traditional position position themselves to counteract these biases? Okay, so I've done said a lot of different presentations about solo practitioners and why firms don't like that, for people from in-house. Both of those types of candidates actually are employable. Like, they can get jobs. I used to think that, coming from that sort of background wasn't helpful, but it actually can be. So how does it work when you, for example, when you're in-house? Like, how do you get a position in a law firm when you're in-house? The best way to do it is to frame your in-house experience as like one type of thing, like you're an expert in municipal law, or you're doing something related to some type of environmental law, or you're, some sort of expertise that is unusual that law firms can't necessarily find that easily. And that is very, very effective. Like, if you're able to, frame your experience as someone that, is able to, has very well-defined experience, and you can get jobs. Attorneys from accounting firms, like if you're like an expert in ERISA, you do something related to health law, or I've seen attorneys that have spent their entire careers working in hospitals get multiple offers, because of their healthcare experience. So that's one of the best ways if you're a non-traditional candidate. In terms of being a solo practitioner, it's the same thing. Like, I've had 2 solo practitioners this year that I've got positioned for. Both of them had expertise in one type of law that was difficult for law firms to find with law firm attorneys. So the most important thing you can do is look like you're focused on one thing. I've seen in-house, solo practitioners get jobs as partners, but in almost every case, their experience looked like it was framed to one thing. So one of the mistakes that in-house attorneys and also solo practitioners make, I look at resumes like all day long. I mean, not all day long, but a good portion of the day, every day. And when I look at these resumes, the only thing I care about is, does this person, are they focused on one thing? Because a lot of times an in-house lawyer will just mention like 15 different things they're working on. That's not marketable. A solo practitioner may say they do criminal, real estate, and all these different things, and they think that having all that different experience makes them marketable, but it's actually not. So the way to think about it is, lawyers and law firms are typically experts in one thing. Litigator doesn't do a real estate lawyer doesn't do, trust and estates. They're all experts. So, and that's what clients pay for. That's what you would want if you were going to a lawyer. If you're going to a lawyer, you need a real estate transaction. You wouldn't want someone that does, immigration law. You would want someone who's focused. So this is something for everyone to think about in their career and also on your resumes. You don't have to mention that you worked on 15 different things. You just need to look like you worked on one thing. So you should always change your resume to reflect that. You can certainly, maybe if you want, bring up other practice areas, but you're going to be much less marketable if you do that. I'm astonished, like, how many in-house attorneys get multiple interviews when they're focused. I've had people like in environmental law get like 6 jobs. Like, you just wouldn't believe it. So you have to look like you're focused on one practice area. If you're focused on one practice area, then you can always get jobs. But even if you're unemployed, have the focus. There's one other thing I want to talk about. This is just, another example. I think I gave this last week, but I'll give it again. So 2, 3, 5. So say you graduated from law school. This is an example in 2030. Let's not 20. Say you graduated 2030. You are a, real estate lawyer, real estate. So, and there are, in your class, or no, let's just say nationally. Nationally, there's maybe, out of 30,000 law school graduates, maybe each year, maybe there's 3,000. That's probably the time. 3,000 people that become real estate lawyers. So year 1, you've got 3,000. Right? Still doing it. It's national. Year 2, you might have 2,500. Year 3, there might be 1,750. Example. Still doing it. Year 5, there might be literally like 1,200. Year 10, there might be 300. So then year 15, there might be 100. 150, 100. So this is how marketability works. So, and this is national. So, all these people that started off as real estate attorneys are just kind of falling away and, doing other stuff. And so by the time you get to year 5, there's only 1,000. And if you're in, like, say you're in Chicago, there might only be, 50 of those people, right? Or maybe less, 50 people doing that work in Chicago, the country. So, and then, and then you get into year 10 and there only might be, 25 or 20, I don't know. So you become more marketable over time if you're focused on one practice area, because there's not a lot of people like you. I mean, there's just, you're focused. And so because of that focus, there's, your marketability increases. And, and here, I'll just another thing here, firms care about your law school. Firms care about your grades, law school, all that sort of thing. So they care about all that, so that, but when you get here, when there's not a lot of you, fewer firms care. And then here, most don't care, right? So, so that's how it works. So you may think, you may think that the law school you went to matters. You may think that, that the, your grades matter and all this kind of stuff. But when there becomes fewer of you in a market like Chicago, they can't be beggars, because, there might only be, if they have a job, there might only be, 2 people or 3 people that apply, 3 people in Chicago. So think about that. So they just don't have a lot of options. So this is what marketability is all about. It's about having a focus, because if you have a focus, and the law firm's hiring you for a focus, like there's not a lot, they don't have a lot of choices. So they can't say we care about this person's grades and everything right here, the quality of law school. I mean, the big firms would care about your law school still, but they're just not, they can't hire enough people. They don't have enough people. So if you're focused, you get a job. And this is what it's all about. So having a focus in something makes you, much, much more marketable than others. And this 50 number might even be high. So this is how you need to think about it. Like, if you're focused, like, you just keep being focused, then, the firms are going to hire you. This is what they do. They can't be, they don't have enough options. So I hope that, that answers your question. I mean, about how that's done. It's very, very important. Let's see, next question. In cases where an attorney receives feedback that they were not hired due to perceived lack of firm commitment or fit, what steps can they take to address this in future interviews? Address. Okay, so a lot of times when firms reject you, they'll just give these kind of open answers, don't really mean anything, to you, and they'll, instead of saying, I mean, they're not going to tell you that people didn't like you, that that sort of thing. Commitment is a big one, or fit. I mean, every firm has a certain type of culture. So then they will reject people who don't fit into that culture. Honestly, the culture can be, all of these things that, you just wouldn't imagine. I remember this one firm, I knew the person who was hiring there. It's like a mid-sized firm based in LA. And I had a friend there that was on the hiring committee. And so the people that came in, and this is, again, I don't like saying this, don't get mad at me for saying it, but he said, we're just a bunch of Jewish guys, and it's kind of what we're looking for. And I was like, okay, but again, I'm not, judging that. I interviewed with another firm when I was a young attorney moving to Los Angeles, and the culture was just crazy. Like, people, leather pants and like chains, and it was weird. It was a good firm, but sometimes you're not just a good fit for their culture, and that's not something that you can really fix. I mean, there's different cultures in different firms. I mean, some firms, are very have Democrats. I mean, other firms, it's the opposite. And, so people hire people sometimes that are like them because they feel more comfortable with them. You can't fix that. But a lack of firm commitment, that question, that is kind of a big one. That often means that they think maybe, you're not going to work hard enough, be dedicated enough when you go there. If that's the case, then you can fix that. But you can't fix culture. Culture is like one of the most important things. Like, people, are just, groups of people have certain cultures, and if you don't fit into that, that's not something you can fix. And this is difficult it is to say that. It's just kind of how it is. Okay. So the next question is, when applying to smaller firms, or more importantly, do you suggest research salary base to prepare for negotiation? So you just, when you go into a firm, you need to wait till you get an offer. So everything, you're applying to work for someone. So anytime you bring up things that sidetrack, the hiring, then they're going to be much less likely to hire you. So how do you research, salary base and prepare for negotiations? The best thing you can do is just wait until the firm, makes you an offer. The thing to keep in mind with any salary negotiations is, if there are other people in your class year or close by to that have certain salaries, they're never going to pay you more money than they pay other people at that level. So there's often no negotiation. But if there aren't people at your class level, working there, then you certainly can negotiate the salary. If you are at a firm where you have employment stability, when you're interviewing, you can tell them what you're making and see if they'll negotiate that with you. But most of the time, smaller firms, the problem with smaller firms, salary negotiation, is smaller firms have clients that typically don't pay as much. So they're working for smaller clients that, aren't going to pay the same hourly rates. And so you can't really demand too much more salary as you're currently making, unless the firm thinks that they can, unless the firm thinks that they really need you for one reason or another. So those kind of negotiations are difficult. But what I recommend is if you're a new attorney and you're having a hard time, you're losing your current job, or you have other things that you have other issues with that. So thanks for okay. Give me 1 second. I just have to grab this. So back in 1 second. Grab this bird. Just give me 1 second. Sorry. I apologize. I have this crazy situation with a bird. But give me 1 second. Okay, so this is a good question. So the person says, I recently lost a training contract for failing a bar exam. How do I make it look like I'm not training going down with the interview? Okay, well, that's a good question. So first of all, lots of people fail the bar exam. I mean, it's extremely common. People from the best law schools do. I had a woman once that, that approached me to work with her that went to Yale Law School, that failed the California bar exam 4 times. Kamala Harris, running for president, she failed the bar exam. Lots of people fail the bar exam. So all you do when you're interviewing is you tell them you failed the bar exam. And it's really not that big of a deal. A lot of people fail the bar exam. It's, bar exams are definitely usually fail for just not studying enough because people are busy or whatever. And so, it's not that big of a deal. When you're interviewing, you talk about how you failed the bar exam. That's it. No one is going to, look too badly upon you for failing it. And you still can get a job when you do it. The only problem is if you have failed the bar exam, you typically will need to look at often, smaller firms to start, and then you can start your upward trajectory from there. So, you fail, you want to take it again and, you pass. But yeah, people fail the bar exam all the time. I place candidates all the time that fail the bar exam. It's not, it's not a bad thing. Hold you back a little. I remember the dean of Stanford Law School failed the bar exam. She went over to get a job in Emmanuel, Los Angeles, California bar exam. So people fail it all the time. I would not, worry about it. Fail. It's not a big deal. Okay, so this next question is, what are the prospects of a 65-year-old attorney who wants to enter into legal employment? Okay, well, there's kind of 2 questions there. It's, I guess, someone that's 65 wants to, enter being an attorney. The people are attorneys. I've placed people in legal roles that are in their 80s. So it's not impossible if you're 65 to get a position. Typically what I've seen in terms of how people get positions when they enter the law profession later in their careers, they typically will get jobs with smaller firms, often solo practitioners, people that will take a chance on them because they need people to do work, they need people who cost a lot of money and that sort of thing. But one of the things about law firms, so there are several law firms that they have mandatory retirement sometimes at 60 or 65. And the reason for that typically is a person doesn't have the gas they have when they're younger and won't necessarily, it's just they just don't have the drive. Other times, older attorneys are kind of pushed out just because or have a difficult time getting jobs with law firms because they resent taking orders from people that are in their 20s. So, but if I was you, I would try to apply to solo practitioners. There's always a lot of them in every city. And I think for very small law firms, and that would be the way to do it. Another thing you could do is you could start your own practice. And this is actually a good point for every attorney here. Starting your own practice. 1 second. So starting your own practice is something that anyone can do at any stage of their career. So I've seen attorneys that, literally are, been 10 years in the top law firms in the world. They might have been litigators, they become family law attorneys, they just open their own practice, or others trust the state's attorneys or whatever. So opening your own practice is always a good idea for someone that may have a difficult time getting a traditional job, and you can do very well. I mean, there are, membership sites that you can join where you get cases from other personal injury attorneys, or where you can get training to be a trusted state's attorney or do tax controversy. So anyone could start their own practice. It's actually very easy, and most people that do it, get training, learn about it from other attorneys, and are do end up pretty successful. So that's always a good option for people at any point in their career. Thanks again for all these questions. I will answer everyone's questions that you have or you asked about this workshop. Okay, I'm in the market to move for a law firm. I do not have prior experience in a law firm, but do have 10 years of relevant services, legal and compliance. How do I work with your team to source opportunities? I've uploaded my resume to the BCG portal and have applied to roles, but I'm wondering if I should take action. Okay, so there's two different things. So working with a recruiter are very limited people that they can work with. In most cases, if you don't have experience in a law firm, you've been doing something else and they've never gotten experience, it's very, very difficult to transition to a law firm, especially with that much experience, because law firms are going to need to have roles that match exactly what you do. And then there's the problem of, never having worked in a law firm. So, if you go to work at, I don't know, what would be a good firm, Baker McKenzie. So you go to work for Baker McKenzie, in, I don't know, say they have an office in Miami. So you go to work for Baker McKenzie, you're there for 10 years. So everyone in the legal, everyone knows what, it is like, what it is like, and quality of work required. And they know that, especially if you've been there for 10 years, because, Baker McKenzie is a great firm because it's such a good firm. Everyone out there is going to know, what it's going to mean if you have a job there. It's just, because you're going to get certain training, become an expert and so forth. But the problem with going in-house, and I'm not trying to be rude here, but if you go in-house, there's no one knows. So no one knows what is required. So, that's just kind of how that works, so because there's no type of quality that the legal market understands, there's nothing. It's just, no one has any idea. So that's the problem. So, there's, you can't compare to a law firm. So there's that. And then, so some other issues, that, I'm sorry, I'm trying to be rude, but, in-house counsel in most companies will typically refer out of the most sophisticated work to law firms. So, so you're not often doing the same type of work in-house that you would be doing in a law firm. So that's the problem. The other problem is, and this is, I'm glad this is a good question, seniority. So, your seniority, you have a lot of seniority. So in a law firm, will, by 10 years, most law firms will ask people to leave. So, or the person is supposed to be becoming partner. So, you can't walk in as a 10th year and expect, the people that been at the same law firm for 10 years, and most of them have been asked to leave, and then walk in when they don't know your seniority, what's required of your job, and then that as a senior attorney expect to be, same level in terms of what you're being considered for, a partnership and all that sort of thing, and doing high level work, people that have also have 10 years of experience. So so that's kind of the problem. It's not it's not easy to do what you're doing. So my advice to you, if you want to work in a law firm, would be to, to make sure your resume matches exactly what law firms are seeking in terms of what their clients are paying for, and to look like as much of an expert as you can. And then, but then realizing these are kind of all the obstacles you have. It's very hard. It's very difficult because you have to be in a position where you have very unique skills that law firm clients are paying for. And then that law firm has to have a reason for hiring you with so much experience when you're going to be at a higher billing rate, high billing rates. I'll talk about one more thing. There's billing rates. This is something that everyone should understand, helpful for your career. So, when you're like, 1, 2, 3, or 2, 3, 4. So, when you have, these billing rates, it's it's easy, it's easy to give you work, because clients like lower price, or clients like lower billing rates and so forth. And then when you get to be like, for 7 years of experience, six, you're competent and can do high level work. And so same thing in seven. But what happens when you get to be like 8, 9, or 10? You're hard to give you work. And the reason it's hard to give you work is because your billing rate. So your billing rate starts to approach approaches partners. And clients prefer partners doing the work, and additionally, partners make more money when they do their own work. What that means is that it's very difficult for law firms to give senior attorneys work because their billing rate's higher. The clients would prefer someone with high billing rates to do the work, and then the partners make more money when they do their own work. So that's why people get asked to leave, especially large law firms when they get more senior, because there's just the firm can't give them work unless the firm thinks this person's going to make partner and they're like really on top of everything. There's really no reason for them to they don't want to. So if you're trying to transition from in-house, you can imagine the challenges of this whole thing. So how do you do that? You try to find hopefully a smaller firm that would be interested in what you do, but also has, clients need that work. I don't know, if firms need people with compliance work. That would be something that would be, important to understand. This next question is, I've attended a lot of these webinars and take thorough notes. Sometimes I find the interview, I take a thorough look through the BCG website, can't find the recordings. What am I doing to find this recording when it's over? So the recordings are typically made live after the webinar. I think they go on the recording site, BCG, but I'll look into that, but they're not made live right after the webinar. They're typically made live, like, they have to be edited, I think, maybe like 4 or 5 days after the webinar. Next question. You mentioned that preparation is key to understanding the firm's culture before an interview. What specific strategies you recommend for reaching dynamics just beyond their public facing materials? Are there particular areas during the interview that will help reveal more about their work environment? Well, I don't probably want to ask those questions during the interview, because any question you answer that shows that you may have any doubts or expectations, things about the environment, it can kind of go against you, because it can show that you might not be interested in the firm despite that. But some other things that I would recommend is just once you get the interview and and you've gone through and you've gotten a sense of the people and so forth, after that's happened, you're typically hopefully will get the offer. And once you get the offer, you can always ask questions. Like, people are really open in most cases to questions after they make you an offer, because they're interested and want to hire you. So the goal of any interview is really to get to the next step. And the more you get to the next step, the better off you're going to be. And so those are, that's kind of how I would deal with it. But typically we'll get a sense of things like at lunches, or at lunch, or, if you get further interviews, you will. After that, you'll typically get a much better sense of kind of the way the firm is. You would typically want to ask your question after you get the offer. So you touched on the importance of asking insightful questions at the end of the interview. You suggest some specific questions that not only demonstrate genuine interest, but also provide valuable insights into the firm's expectations for the role. Okay, so the questions I recommend asking in the interview are more about like what you can do to be, what does success look like, what's most important to you in this job, how would I what would I do to do a good job, like a good employee after 60 days. Like, those kind of questions show that you're interested in doing hard work, that and in my opinion, like, those are questions along those lines, and what you can do to succeed, those things are going to be are really the most important. Anything else you ask that is going to, anything else you ask that's not kind of related to something like that is, it's not necessarily related to your performance and so forth, is not really the best idea. So if you ask any questions that will potentially give the idea that you might not perform there, do well there, or have questions that they can answer negatively, are, really the best. Questions also, like, about the kind of work that they do, like, Like that's kind of important, like asking questions about that. But you typically don't want to ask a lot about culture and things like that. You want to kind of pick that up in the interview. And you also need to remember that every time you're interviewing, the firm's also likely looking at other people. And the ratio of interviews to jobs. I mean, I've seen firms that have interviewed like 90 people and made offers to 2 or 1. So it's not easy to get a job after an interview. So you just need to, keep in mind it's very, very difficult. So you need to kind of do everything you can to convince the employer to hire you without bringing up negative stuff. I'm not sure. You discussed the significance of highlighting relevant experiences during an interview. How would you recommend approaching this when transitioning from a non-traditional legal role back to an environment where your past experiences might directly align, with the job you're applying for? Okay, so, again, one of the problems depends on the non-traditional environment, but one of the problems when you're trying to, transition from a non-traditional legal role back to a law firm environment is that the law firm is, nervous about if you left a law firm to go to another environment. Because if you left the law firm environment, you left the law firm for a reason. So, the law firm is going to think, well, maybe this person is going to be likely to leave again and go to a different environment. So that's, one of the obstacles that you're, up against. But the most important thing you can do in terms of your experience is, you need to, and this is all you need to do. You need to, make your experience the same as it would have been in a law firm. So, and make it look that way. And that's not easy to do. Now I'm not asking why, but you need to make it look the same as it would be in a law firm. So law firms are focused. Law firms are focused, meaning their attorneys typically do one practice area, and they're not kind of going all over the place and working on things that you might be in-house. And so you need to look like you're focused on a practice area, because if you're focused on a practice area, then you're going to be much more likely, to get hired, because that's what clients want when they go to law firms. Someone asked a question about receiving the recording. Yeah, the recordings will be sent out to everyone. Will be available after the webinar. If you don't already have a book of business or have a small one, how can you express an interview that will bring in more business to the firm? Okay, so that's very common. So a lot of attorneys don't have books of business. And so what they'll do oftentimes is they'll put together, these kind of business plans and so forth that they can often, sell to a firm. They'll tell the firm, that they're going to, be able to bring in a larger book of business. So the way you sell that you bring more business is you talk about, platform, so platform. So a lot of times a platform will offer, gives you an opportunity to bring in more business. So that just means, if you have a firm that, has a better brand than you work alone, or wherever your business is, you could talk about that. If I have a larger firm, it'll give me the opportunity to bring in my clients, because clients, really would prefer to work with a larger. With my clients, I would have more business if I had a larger firm. I could cross sell. That's one thing. Sometimes people do business plans. I haven't seen business plans really work that well. I mean, they certainly can, but they don't. I haven't seen them work that well in the past. But the biggest way to sell is that you get more clients if you had a larger firm. The clients that you want to bring in all want a larger firm with better brand, and that's true. Like if people have legal issues, they, or companies, they want to go to a firm that has, more resources, that's a bigger firm, that, that has a better brand. And so that to me is one of the best ways to sell. You need to sell yourself to a large. Okay, I think I've answered most of the questions. So I appreciate everyone being here today. Yeah, I think I've answered all the questions. But there's some other questions here that I've answered that are related to the questions. So next week, I'll go through a bunch of questions that law firms actually ask. So there's a ton of them. And I'll also make sure I email a book to everyone who's registered for the webinar today. It'll be a link to an Adobe PDF. And I'll also do that with the document that I always, that I share with all the candidates to get interviews. One thing I can tell you is I really commend you for being on this webinar today. And I know sometimes these go a long time. But this particular webinar, if you understand all this stuff and you took business and you go back and watch it, you read the books and the stuff I'm telling you, it will transform your ability to get hired. And like I said, people that show up for that follow the advice I give on your resume, the interview, they're being able to get jobs 5 times or 3 times or whatever more effective. So I really, I'm sure everyone understood what I talked about on this today, but I really would recommend reading the book. and also the interview that I do with our candidates. And then in the interview prep with the candidates, there's also 5 articles that you can click through to. Those are articles that I share with firms that I've shared with firms, telling the people they should hire and avoid. So, and law firms have also found that, very helpful. And then next week's webinar, common questions and answers, I think will also be very effective for you. It won't be as long as the webinars today, but going into those questions and discussing them should be helpful. So thanks again, everyone, for being on the webinar. And I apologize for the noise in the background today. I had literally a parrot in my office, and it was causing a lot of stuff. And then I had someone delivering something. So thank you again for being here, and I will talk to everyone